On the 16th of January 1917, at the height of the First World War, a top-secret German telegram on its way from Berlin to the German embassy in Washington was intercepted by British naval intelligence. It was passed on to their secret code-breaking centre, Room 40. The telegram had been encrypted with one of the toughest codes ever devised. The job of cracking it fell to a 30-year-old man, an old Etonian with a gift for languages and a love of amateur dramatics. This is the story of his attempt to decipher the telegram. It would be one of the most important episodes in the history of code breaking. At stake was the future of Europe. On the first day of the war, the British cable ship Telconia slipped quietly across the North Sea and dropped anchor off the Dutch coast near Germany. Under the cover of darkness, the crew hauled up Germany's transatlantic cables, her only secure lines of communications to her embassies throughout the world, and cut them. This act of sabotage forced Germany to use a public route of communication, the wireless. As the war progressed, the airways were thick with German dots and dashes, and Britain set up listening stations all over the country to eavesdrop on them. The Germans were well aware of this, so they transmitted their signals in code, transforming each message into a series of numbers, meaningless to their enemies. After 3 years of fighting, the war had reached stalemate. Britain and Germany were incurring massive casualties, but with no hope of victory. Meanwhile, America was still neutral, ignoring British pleas for help. Then, on January the 17th, 1917, a British wireless operator intercepted an encrypted telegram on its way from Berlin to the German embassy in Washington. It was to be one of the most extraordinary messages in the history of warfare. The telegram was rushed to a secret naval code-breaking department tucked away in Whitehall. It went by the innocuous-sounding name of Room 40. Room 40 consisted of about 50 codebreakers, recruited through the old boy network of Eton, Harrow and Oxbridge. Their job of decoding this and any other telegram was made monumentally difficult by the German decision to encrypt their communications with one of the toughest methods so far devised. For centuries, the military had used something called a cipher. A cipher swaps each individual letter in a message with a different letter or symbol. For example, if I encrypt the word gun with a cipher, it might look like this. But by the end of the 19th century, every type of cipher had been cracked. So rather than using ciphers, the Germans preferred to use codes. A code does not replace each individual letter with a symbol. Instead, it replaces each whole word with a number. The number is called a code group. The code groups are listed in a code book, and in the one I'm compiling here, the word gun would be replaced with the code group 1310. A coded message typically looks like this. From a codebreaker's point of view, decrypting a coded message is an incredibly difficult challenge. For example, this code group here could represent any of the thousands of words from Aardvark to Zulu. Without a code book, there seems to be no way of working out what this message really means. It appears that Room 40's only hope of decoding the message to Washington was to somehow obtain a copy of the German codebook. In code-breaking jargon, this is known as a capture. The world's leading historian of secret codes, David Kahn, explained the immense significance of a captured codebook.
If you can get a capture, you've won the code breakers lottery, because then they don't have to do any work. They found the actual code book which the enemy is using, and they can use this to solve the codes just as well as the enemy himself can.
This is a rare example of a capture. It's the actual code book taken from the body of a drowned German officer, the book still clasped to his chest by rigor mortis after his ship, the Magdeburg, had been sunk in the Baltic in 1914. But the Germans had several distinct code books. Room 40 could tell which codebook had been used for the telegram to Washington from the second number group, the code indicator. The Germans had used codebook 13042, a codebook that Room 40 didn't have. Their task now seemed impossible.
The greatest strength of a code is that if you want to solve it, you have an awful lot of code words to try to solve and figure out what they mean. You have to reconstruct much of this code book.
Room 40 knew that 13042 was a code reserved for the highest level German diplomatic communications. This confirmed the importance of the message to Washington, and immediately it was sent for decoding to a 30-year-old lieutenant commander called Nigel de Grey. He was one of Room 40's most gifted codebreakers. In fact, he's one of the greatest codebreakers of all time.
But I remember him as a slightly remote but rather fascinating man. Rather elegant, very good looking, very charming. He was very keen on the theatre, on music, but not a performer.
He spoke Italian, and certainly he spoke French. And I suspect that he spoke German. I mean, he must have, really, otherwise he wouldn't have been so hot at decoding. It wasn't fashionable, really, to talk about knowing German.
Fashionable or not, de Grey's German was excellent. But how would he even have started the seemingly impossible task of decoding this telegram to Washington? Well, although it looks formidable, the codebook system does have one weakness.
You can't change code books so quickly. You have a book like this. This is 1,000 pages. It was arranged by people. It took a long time to decide which words are going to go in here, to set it in type and all of that, and then print it. It's not so easy to change code books.
So how long would a code like this be used for? Typically weeks?
Months, years.
The fact that it's very hard to change codebooks in the theatre of war is the system's Achilles heel. This is because the codebreaker, over time, can marry intelligence reports of actual events with encoded messages that seem to be related to those same events. This gives him tiny clues as to what words certain numbers represent. To find out how this works, I've come to meet Rosemary North, a professional codebreaker who worked in Britain and Singapore during the 60s and 70s.
This is a very short one. It only has 4 groups, including the indicator.
Rosemary has devised a simple example to illustrate this technique of matching actual events with a coded message.
This was received at 3:35.
Let's imagine we've intercepted this coded message sent to enemy ships. Initially we can't decode it, but later we receive intelligence that the ships had set sail and sunk 2 British frigates.
Having noted that these German ships sailed shortly after this was received, you think this could have been ordering them to sail, or take it in English for ease. You think of the most straightforward way to tell a ship to sail. It would be sail at such and such a time.
Right.
So you think maybe that's sail, maybe that's at. And you
Rosemary
find out
then
if
checks
they're
her guess by
approaching
exploiting another weakness which some
approaching
code books
time.
have.
And you think about what
They tend to be built in alphabetical and numerical order, so words beginning with A are usually represented by the lowest numbers, and words beginning with Z with the highest.
this gives you
So
a
in Rosemary's example, it's highly likely that a low number like 0091 means at, because at begins with a letter that comes early in the alphabet, and that a high number like 8225 means sail, because sail begins with a letter from late in the alphabet.
You take an idea that might work and you test it to see if it does. If it does, then you carry on and try and make the next link work. This begins with 8, 9 something, therefore it is going to be later in the alphabet than SA. You know this is likely to be a time, if this is at. It could have been dawn, except that it's too late in the numerical sequence, so it's more likely to begin with something like S. And because there is nothing afterwards to qualify it, it's not likely to be 6 o'clock or 6:30 or 6 p.m. or 6 a.m. So you can more or less assume that 8977 is sunrise, and it's worth a try. I mean, this is partly intuition.
Right.
It's not only logic.
In a way, this is useless because it's after the event, but
Well, yes, but you have something really valuable here because you have accessed some codes for the beginning of your reconstruction of the code
Right.
book, which will enable you to prevent it happening in future,
future,
possibly.
right.
What you'd do is you'd look at the at there.
what Rosemary has just shown me is the first tiny step in a long, laborious process that de Grey and his colleagues carried out for years. They examined thousands of intercepts and intelligence reports, constantly checking to see if their first guess at a code group's meaning in one message made sense in all the others.
This is the actual version he used.
This was the fruit of their labours, the actual book in which de Grey and his team reconstructed German code 13042.
Inside you can see each code number and the corresponding word.
And do you see how he's put there 41313 Chatham, and then he's put a date,
Right.
presumably the date and time of the signal, which gave him the clue that that might be Chatham.
On the 17th of January 1917, de Grey turned to his reconstructed codebook as he confronted the telegram to Washington. His years of code breaking were about to face the ultimate test. By 1917, the battlefields of Europe were deadlocked. America, with her mighty resources of men and machines, held the key to victory, but she remained resolutely neutral. Britain desperately wanted her in the war, Germany wanted to keep her out. Back in London, Nigel de Grey was still poring over the intercepted German telegram. But could he crack it?
So Rosemary, this is the telegram. What strikes you immediately about it?
Well, horror at first, because I know...
The telegram contained over 150 code groups. De Grey's first step was to turn to his partial reconstruction of German code 13042, which he and his colleagues had so painstakingly compiled over the last 3 years. Would it now bear fruit?
This code here is interesting. 97556 is very late in the overall sequence.
Right. Shall I try and dig it up?
Yes, do. I would suspect that that's a signature of a person because the people's names would have been added late in the process of devising the code because they change.
Right. Hang on, 975. Zimmerman.
Zimmerman.
Right,
So you
to
know it's
Washington.
of major significance.
Right.
Arthur Zimmerman was the newly appointed German foreign minister. This was clearly a message from the highest level of the Kaiser's government. De Grey looked up another code group, this one, 5905. It meant Krieg, the German for war. Next to it was a crucial code group, 98092.
Here we go, 98092 U-boat. Right, U-boat war.
Here's 14936.
Einzahler. It's unrestricted.
Zimmerman was advocating unrestricted U-boat warfare, a new and deadly German strategy. From now on, their submarines wouldn't only attack warships, but merchant ships as well. Germany believed that this plan would strangle Britain's vital supply lines, starving the country into submission. At this point, only 2 hours into his decryption, de Grey realised he was onto something big. He later said,
Sweating with excitement, I went on, because I didn't doubt the importance of what I had in my hands.
the next code groups continued to raise the stakes. They revealed Zimmerman's greatest fear, the one thing that could jeopardise the German plan.
Right, here we go. Ausbruch, outbreak.
I'd like to know what 39689 is.
USA.
Outbreak of war with the USA.
Right.
At this point, they would have been jumping up and down with excitement.
Germany was afraid that if the United States came into the war with its massive industrial power and its manpower, it could send troops over and send supplies and support over that would eventually defeat Germany.
What Zimmerman said next was diplomatic dynamite, a duplicitous plan to ensure America stayed out of the war.
14991. Einverstanden. Einverstanden is to understand, to...
So an understanding,
Right.
with Mexico, like an alliance.
Zimmerman wanted to exploit the long-standing border dispute between Mexico and America. If America entered the war, Germany would offer Mexico money and guns to attack America's southern states.
If Mexico were to invade the United States in the southern states, the Americans might have to utilize their troops fighting this invasion in the south against the Mexicans instead of sending their troops over to Europe to fight the Germans over there.
De Grey was so excited he could barely breathe. He now had unequivocal evidence that Germany was inciting a war on American soil. Surely this would compel the Americans to join the Allies.
He ran to Reginald Hall, the director of naval intelligence. He showed it to Hall and said, "Captain, do you want to bring the Americans into the war? If so, here's the tool that we have to do it."
But now, just as Nigel de Grey was about to celebrate his greatest triumph, Admiral Hall brought him crashing down to earth. A wily operator, Hall knew that things weren't so simple.
If this telegram were given to the Americans, they would then show their outrage to the rest of the world. Immediately, the Germans would realise that their code had been broken. They would then change to a completely new set of code books, thereby depriving Room 40 of a source of intelligence that was invaluable to the Allied war effort. Now, this is a constant dilemma for codebreakers. How do you exploit information that you've got from deciphering enemy communications without letting the enemy know that you've broken their code?
Admiral Hall had to somehow convince the Germans that the Allies hadn't decoded the telegram, but had stolen the original uncoded message. But Hall knew the Germans were unlikely to believe that anything had been stolen from their embassy in America. Hall spotted the solution to his problem in de Grey's decryption.
Most secret for Your Excellency's personal information, and to be handed on to the Imperial Minister in Mexico.
Hall realised that the telegram would be retransmitted from Washington to Mexico. He now made a brilliant intuitive leap. Hall guessed that the retransmitted telegram would be subtly different from the original. If he went public with this second version of the telegram, he could claim it had been stolen in Mexico by a corrupt embassy official. And that was a story the Germans would swallow. Hall now turned to the seedy world of international espionage. He contacted his secret agent in Mexico, known only as Mr. H. Hall ordered Mr. H to get, by any means necessary, the telegram that had been retransmitted to the ambassador in Mexico City. So Mr. H broke into the Western Union Telegraph office in Mexico City and stole a copy of the retransmitted telegram. The plan now hinged on whether this version of the telegram was noticeably different from the original. Mr. H rushed it back to London. In room 40, de Grey worked furiously to decode it. Sure enough, it had the differences that Hall had hoped for. It was dated 3 days later and was signed not by Zimmerman, but by the German ambassador in Washington, Johannes von Bernstorff. With his cover story intact, Hall released the decoded telegram. The plan worked perfectly. Within 6 weeks, a furious America declared war on Germany, and everyone believed the Mexican cover story. Room 40 had cracked the enemy code and kept that extraordinary fact a secret.
It's probably the single most important intelligence coup in all of history. It had enormous effects on the basis of this single decipherment. It brought the United States into the European war, which was then only a European war, made it a world war, and helped bring the United States onto the world stage, which it really hadn't fully been until that moment.
By cracking the German code, Nigel de Grey had brought America into the war, guaranteeing an Allied victory, shortening the war and saving countless lives on both sides. After the war, de Grey quietly returned to his job as a publisher. No one outside Room 40 was aware that he'd changed history. De Grey had shown that codes were insecure because code books could not be changed easily and regularly. In World War II, the military returned to using ciphers, such as the infamous Enigma cipher machine. But Enigma was also broken, and with the advent of mass communication in the 50s and 60s, cryptographers came under intense pressure to find something better. Something that could defy even the most determined codebreaker. Eventually, in the 1970s, they found it. An unbreakable cipher tailor-made for the information revolution. Next week, I'll be telling the previously untold story of the cipher that can guarantee security on the internet.
The next episode of The Science of Secrecy will be this Sunday at 6:45. And for more information on codes and code breaking and a chance to win a holiday to Egypt, visit our website at channel4.com/next step. Competition details can also be found on Foretell page 360.